Now, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome writer, director, and former programmer Jane Giles to discuss London's legendary Scala Cinema and her new documentary, Scala Club Cinema, which tells the riotous inside story of the infamous sex, drugs, and rock and roll repertory house, which inspired a generation during Britain's turbulent Thatcher years. Jane and I will be having a chat for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be taking questions. So, Jane, I need you to turn your camera on now and your sound, and you are. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Lovely to have you with us, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Obviously, we've talked about this for a bit, but there's always more to be said. So first of all, I wanted to just ask you if you could just talk a little bit about what the Scala was exactly and how did you come to work there? So for people who've never been, who didn't know, and who would like to understand a bit more about what it was.
Sure, thank you, Catherine, for having me. It's a real honour to be with the great ICO. So the Scala was a repertory cinema. Repertory means repeating programme, a programme that repeats for as long as the audiences are interested. And it began in 1978 in Tottenham Street, which is just off Goodge Street in the West End of London. It had its deep roots in a socialist collective called the Other Cinema, which was a really interesting organisation that worked across distribution and was trying to move into exhibition. And it was built on the site of an old cinema called the Scala. It was built on the site of an old theatre called the Scala Theatre, which was on this corner of Charlotte Street and Tottenham Street. As I said, Goodge Street. Really interesting building, which was demolished in '69, and the Other Cinema was built there in '76. Didn't work. It was showing 12-hour-long, amazing 12-hour-long documentaries, how Yukon moved the mountains, for example, to what we call small but specialised audiences. It was a great thing, but not financially viable. Out of the ashes of the Other Cinema came a new organisation called the Scala, which was led by Stephen Woolley, who was one of the front of house managers of the Other Cinema and had cut his teeth by being an usher at the Screen on the Green at the time in which the Sex Pistols were doing their midnight special live show when they were banned from music venues, but cinema venues hosted punk bands at that time. So Stephen really revitalised the Scala in Tottenham Street, the cinema on Tottenham Street. And by about 1981, it was a really viable concern. They were doing lots of music gigs, as well as a daily changing programme of double bills, triple bills, and all-nighters, really specialising in cult movies, but also showing the classics and some experimental work. And like I say, with a real bias on contemporary music, on post-punk music, partly because of Stephen's own interests, but also because that's where there was a really vibrant audience. The music press was covering the film events as well as the gigs. So the audiences just grew and grew. And in 1981, Scala lost its lease on the building to actually Channel 4, who set up their offices for the new UK Force television channel. And the cinema was bought out. The cinema at that time was owned by Nick Powell, formerly of Virgin, Rich Branson's business partner, later to become the great Nick Powell, who directed the National Film and Television School. He joined partnerships with Stephen Woolley, and they moved the Scala up to King's Cross, to the shell of an old pitch palace that had been built in 1920. And that's when I discovered it. I never went to Tottenham Street, but in August 1981, I went to my first all-nighter at the Scala in King's Cross. I was 16, and I brought the programme along. This is the August 1981 programme. One of the things the Scala was famous for was its beautiful fold-out programme flyers. So there we go. And that's what it was like on the back. And there's the programme that I went to with my mates from school: Dark Star, Assault on Precinct 13, Halloween, Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue and Psychic Killer.
Oh, good choice.
So that's what the Scala was. It changed my life. It basically introduced me at the age of 16 as a movie fan who'd been to the Duke of York cinema in Brighton. My dad took me there to see a double bill of Third Rock and The Brighton Man. And that was, I'd never seen anything like it, actually. I don't know if I'd ever seen a black and white film before, apart from being a little kid and going to watch The Wizard of Oz and complaining because it was in black and white and I didn't understand it. So that, I think, really kind of started my love of film. But it was my friends at school and the fact that they were really in that, at that point, 1980, 81, really plugged into what was going on up in London or down in Brighton. And we'd travel to go and see gigs up in town, to go and see film shows. And to go and see an all-night film show was really possible because you get a train up. Film shows, the all-nighters started at about 10:30. You'd watch 5 films in a row. It would cost about £2.50. So it's completely affordable for a school girl, a student. And then you'd come out at 8 o'clock next morning, 7:30, 8 o'clock next morning, feeling a bit worse for wear, and get the train home, and everyone was happy. It was a really good way of discovering cinema.
I remember those all-nighters. And how did you, so that was when you were at school, but how you eventually obviously came to work there. So you'd been there and that was something, that was a place that you'd really loved. How did you then end up getting a job there?
Well, yeah, I really fell in love with the building the first time I saw it. Actually, Sammy, can we have a slide and just have a look at the Scala in 1982? Can we just show people what it looked like? There it is. It's a bit dirty, isn't it? The top of the building is a bit grubby. Yeah, so that's what I would have seen back in 1981, 82. Thanks, Sammy, I think that's fine. And it was this incredible piece of architecture that was sort of like simultaneously right in the middle of King's Cross, just a few hundred yards from the station, but at the same time, weirdly kind of like hidden behind other buildings. So you'd sort of stumble through the mayhem of King's Cross. And it was a chaotic place as a major terminus station. And then suddenly you'd be standing outside this beautiful piece of architecture, which at night had a neon sign, Scala, which means staircase in Italian. And you go in and there'd be like black and white marble stairs all the way winding up to sort of big cafe area, which over the years, first of all, had a sort of jungle mural painted on the walls, because briefly the Scala had stopped being a cinema in about 1975, and by 1980 had become something called the Primatarium, which was a sort of immersive environmental experience to teach audiences about the importance of preserving species. And it was run by an eccentric dentist called Cyril Rosen, based in North London, who had his own primate that he used to carry around with him. But the enterprise failed dismally, and that's the moment at which Stephen Woolley and co moved the Scala up from Tottenham Street into King's Cross. And the jungle mural was a sort of hangover from the Primatarium days. And when the Scala, the first film that Scala showed at the former Primatarium, ex-King's Cross Cinema, was King Kong in a double bill with, I think, Mighty Joe Young. And it sort of set the tone for it. It was a great building. It had once upon a time been a 1,500-seat cinema. By the time it was the Scala, it was just the circle area, not the stalls. The stalls was the snooker club, and the ex-circle area was about 500 seats with kind of false floor and the screen. So it was still very big for a rep cinema. It was, and the screen was huge, and the rake was very steep. I think most people know that the rake is basically the kind of gradient of the seats. So if you're ever in a cinema and you can't see past the person sitting in front of you. It's because it's got a very shallow rake. But if you've ever been in the cinema that you have to walk up lots of steps to get to the very back row, and it feels like you're climbing a mountain, then you're in a cinema with a steep rake. And the Scala had a very steep rake, very good sight lines. The chairs were rather uncomfortable. It had a 35mm, two 35mm projectors that worked on a changeover system. And one 16mm projector. And I think we can see a picture, Sammy, if you have one of the projectors, which I think is photograph 1C. There they are, there's the projection box of the Scala with the projectors. Yeah, so there we go. And in the late 1980s, the Scala came up against a redecoration clause in its lease. Scala had a 12-year lease that had taken out from the people that owned the snooker club. And it was a 12-year lease that started in 1981. And one of the clauses in the lease was to redecorate every 5 years. So the Scala's version of redecorating was this, and we're going to show you a picture now of how the cafe foyer looked. Sammy, if you could find photo 1B. There we go. That's the Scala foyer, cafe foyer. You can see the kind of like serving hatch at the back there that sold sandwiches and coffee and beer and whatnot. So the jungle mural was painted over by a pair of street artists called Yuval and Wigan. And they were at the time doing street art, but also working in nightclubs like the Limelight, and they jetted off to New York to paint clubs in New York. So they did this thing called the Urbanites Go to the Movies, which was based on the Scala programme. And it was a sort of love it or hate it mural. A lot of people missed the gentle Douanier Rousset style jungle animals from previous years. But a lot of people really were into this kind of like style of graffiti. But if you look at the ceiling, you can see it looks a bit ropey. They sort of run out of time and enthusiasm by the time they got to Night of the Hunter, as you can see. Plus the fact they were wobbling around on a really uneven bit of scaffolding. Thank you, Sammy, that's great. So that's what the Scala looked like and felt like. It was very atmospheric. It was very kind of edgy and cool, but also really welcoming cinema. It was a place that attracted people who maybe didn't feel quite at home in places like the National Film Theatre, as it was then, now BFI South Bank, or the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, which was sort of slightly notorious for having a rather difficult programme of experimental avant-garde film. So for people who really like cult movies, like films like Blade Runner and John Carpenter movies, but we're also starting to kind of venture into very style-driven black and white films like Night of the Hunter or Onibaba or those kind of movies. The Scala was a really great place for discovery. I'd failed to get into art school, as I think it says on the ICO blurb. But at the time, it was really hard to get into art school, but it was really quite easy to get into film school, particularly if your film school was a college of higher education, as I was recommended to try for in Reading. And so I wrote an application for film school, and I wrote about the John Cooper Clarke film 10 Years in an Open Net Shirt, because I like punk and I like the movie. And the person that interviewed me was a friend of the director of that film. This is not as nepotistic as it sounds on first telling, but that person turned out to be Laura Mulvey. I had no idea who Laura Mulvey was. I hadn't read any film theory at that point. I hadn't seen Laura's films, Riddles of the Sphinx, or her other films, and that she made with Peter Wallen. And but I don't know, there was something about me that I was very gauche and bit oppositional, and there was, she gave me a chance, and it was great. And at film school I discovered it was actually film, drama and art. It was called Combined Studies. It wasn't even called Film Studies. But I met lots of amazing people there, including my teacher, Richard Kietnowski, who would later become a filmmaker. He made a great film called Love and Death in Long Island with John Hurt, and he was instrumental in the Out on Tuesdays television programme that champions lesbian and gay culture on Channel 4. And Richard had encouraged me in certain kind of ways, including applying for university to do an MA and focusing on just one short film, which was Jean Genet's short film on Champ d'Amour, only 25 minutes, but I'd seen it at the Scala in a bill with Carell, Fassbender's film. And I was really fascinated by it. I was fascinated by the fact that there was no information available about this film, nothing. So I thought it would make a good subject for a thesis, even though this was pre-internet and it was all library research and trying to find people to interview. And the only person that I could find who had written anything at all about Champ d'Amour was the very good friend of the ICO, Tony Raines. So I wrote to Tony, care of the British Film Institute, and I think about 3 months later, he wrote back an incredible letter in purple and silver ink. I'd never seen purple and silver ink before. And he wrote back this kind of fantastic thing, just saying, I don't really know anything, but why don't you try the Cinémathèque Française? And it just got me going, actually. The idea that you could write to somebody like that and they would write back to you was an extraordinary thing. So then I discovered that the novelist Edmund White was writing about Jean Genet's life. Same thing, I wrote to Edmund and he wrote back and he opened lots of doors for me. And I think all of this kind of gave me a bit of confidence to sort of like follow quite difficult paths of research. I applied for a few jobs after my MA and got turned down for all sorts of things like programming the London Filmmakers Co-op, because I went along and they said to me, what was the last film you saw here? And I said gaily, oh, I've never seen a film at the Co-op. So they were like, well, why are you applying for a job here? So that taught me a good lesson about things in life. I applied for a training placement in regional film theatre management that only paid £5,000 for the year, but it was again, it introduced me to the world of learning about how cinemas worked. I'll get to the point, this is a rather long-winded way of saying halfway through that placement, I saw a little job advertised in The Guardian for Scala programmer, £12,000 for the year. And I knew the Scala. I not only had been there when I was 16, but I carried on going all through college. I still loved it. It was my favourite place. And I was interviewed by Stephen Woolley, who owned the Scala, as I said, and I think he responded to my knowledge of the Scala programme. At that time, he was running a company called Palace Pictures, which was one of the early video distributors, and I really liked the Palace films, like Element of Crime, the Lars van Trier film. But I'd also been recommended to Stephen by one of my referees, who was Jane Pilling at the BFI. She was the one who'd given me the placement for that I did at Ipswich, and she had been a programmer at the Scala from 1980 to 82. And I think she recognised the sensibility that I had. I was young, I was 23, but Jane was 23 when Jane Pilling was 23 when she was programming the Scala as well. Stephen Woolley was 21 or 22. So the Scala kind of had track record of employing very young people who were not so knowledgeable about the ways of the film industry. Stephen liked people that did things in a different way. He didn't like it when people kind of followed the old traditional ways of film programming. For example, he liked people that took risks, and he liked people that liked music, and he liked people that liked cult movies. And all of that was a little bit different in what in London at the time was a very vibrant repertory scene. I think it still is a very vibrant repertory scene in London and in other places around the UK. But that was the thing that sort of marked out Scala's difference, was that it did everything. It did the classics, like you saw at the South Bank. It did the experimental films that you'd see at the London Filmmakers Co-op, and it did all of the other stuff as well. And as a repertory cinema, it followed its audience. So if something was programmed and it made more than a certain amount of money at the box office, those films would come right back the following month. This program that I showed you was printed every month, but it only had something like a 2-week lead time. So it meant that I could be programming like 1 month, and if things were doing well in the first 2 weeks of the month that I was working in, then I would bring them right back for the following month. So it had a very kind of quick turnaround, if that makes sense, to the programmers in the audience here. So that's how I got the job at the Scala, yes.
And what were the particular challenges of, I'm just thinking about people who might be listening who work in exhibition now and thinking about what that's like. You know, lots of people obviously start in front of house and then they might end up working in other bits of a building, but also obviously it's a completely different time. So you know, there's no social media, there's no, you know, you can't just like send a sort of digital program to everybody. You can't sign people up by their email. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about what was probably quite a challenging environment, particularly if you were a young woman in the film industry at that time. We're talking like the early, I mean, it's obviously still a challenging environment if you're a young woman, it's 2023, or an old woman, what can I say, a middle-aged woman. I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit for us.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of things about that. Firstly, you're right. You're absolutely right. It's a very good way into any job is by starting on the shop floor. And the training placement that I did in Ipswich taught me front of house. Like I remember watching, as an usherette, I watched Wings of Desire every single night for a week, which was actually a great experience. And really made a kind of like huge impression on me. I also did, I learned projection, I learned finance. So yeah, front of house management. I learned all sorts of, you know, parts of the business. And that was a really important way in. That was the thing that impressed Mr. Woolley when I applied for the job. So I'd certainly continue to recommend anybody that as a way in. A hunger for films as well as like basically knowing every part of the job. So I pitched up, and my predecessor, Mark Vallon, who was just about to leave London after several years to go back to Los Angeles, where he was born. He's a programmer for Landmark Theatres there now still. He taught me the job, and I'm going to show you the tools of my trade at the Scala very briefly. So this was the #1 tool of the trade. This is the original, one of the original Scala telephones. There were 2 of these. I had one and the general manager had one, and I would use mine to phone up film distributors whose details I kept here in an index card box, painstakingly written on and written over. That's Premier Castle Supreme, an amazing booker called Stan Hart and his assistant Eileen Brown, who were responsible for the distribution rights in the UK to the Russ Meyer films, of which the Scala showed many. So that is a well-worn card in my index card box. So I'd spend all day like phoning them up, asking about the availability of films for certain dates. And I use, where's my notebook? I still have all of this rubbish. No, it's not rubbish, actually, it's gold. This is my notes book, complete with Philip Rigby calendar on the cover. And here's an example. I did promise Andrew that I wouldn't say the words Valerian Boracek, but here I am saying the words Valerian Boracek, because In my notebook, this is the research for a Boracek season. Scala showed a lot of Boracek. It had its own kind of auteur system, but instead of it being like Orson Welles and Ozu and the greats, which it did show, but the main auteurs important to the Scala were Pasolini, Boracek and John Waters. There's my research for a Russ Meyer season going on there. So this was my notebook, and I would start by writing down the days of the month, and I put in pencil my ideas. I've been working on kind of programs, and like I said before, carrying over successful bits of double bill from previous months, or thinking, oh, we haven't shown Kenneth Anger's Magic London Cycle for a few months, let's bring that one back, it's probably time. Or let's show Fritz the Cat and Comic Book Confidential and Heavy Metal all together. So, you know, that was the way the programme was put together. It was literally sketched out by me. Then I'd phone up the distributors, I'd find the availability, I'd agree the terms of the booking, which was either, if it was a double bill from two separate distributors, it was 12.5% per film against a minimum guarantee, which I think in those days was about 50 or 60 quid. And if it was a double bill from the same distributor, it would be 25% against a minimum guarantee of about 100 quid or something like that. And if it was a triple bill, it'd be 33.33%. So there we go. I'd put it together, I'd make a note of what the terms were, I'd ink it in to show that it was confirmed. I'd then transfer everything to this ledger, which holds the agreed distribution terms. I won't hold that up for too long. I also kind of like mapped it out as a programme because I needed to work out what times the films were going to be on at. So the third prong is this, was December 1990, with the titles and the times in red ink. And the reason why the programme times were occasionally wrong, sometimes disastrously, was my mathematical skills. I don't have any qualifications in maths, not even one O-level or one GCSE, nothing. I hated maths at school. But I somehow tried to not make too many mistakes in programming, otherwise you get people turning up an hour early or having to stay till 3 o'clock in the morning when they shouldn't be there. And then after the programme had happened, this is the fourth prong, we'd write down the results of the screenings in this ledger. So this shows all the films. That's the box office take. I'll give you an example. Monday the 27th of April 1992, we showed a double bill of Daddy and the Muscle Academy with the Leather Boys. Leather Boys is, I think, 60s sort of British B-movie. Dudley Sutton, I think. Daddy and the Muscle Academy is a Finnish documentary about Tom of Finland. And that made £1,074.89 on the box office. So that was pretty good. And it made £218.25 on the cafe. So we had our target figures, and some things were disastrous. I'm sure I could find something here that's an abject, oh yeah, okay, here's something. Oh, this is sad. It's a double bill of The Harder They Come with something called Time Will Tell. And it made £196 on the box office all day and £40 in the cafe. But the general manager has made a little note, or maybe the programmer has made a note in stars there saying very hot day. So that means nobody wanted to go to the cinema because it was a very hot day. Sammy, could you show the photograph, which is, I think, 1C? No, it's not 1C. It's, is it number 4? It's a black and white picture of me trying to program the cinema, and my colleague Alex Fenner, right, there I am in 1990, staring at that black ledger that I was just showing you with my pencil, like trying to memorize the most successful films. And in the background, you can see my fantastic colleague, Alex Fenner, the general manager. She's pouring through the A to Z, trying to find a plumber to fix the toilets. Because Catherine, you asked about the cinema, and it was a hard place to work because we didn't make much money despite Daddy and the Muscle Academy and the Leather Boys. Mostly we didn't make that kind of money, and it was all a bit hand to mouth, and it was an old cinema, and it was hard to upkeep, and things kept breaking down, including the projectors and sometimes the projectionists, and that's the way it went. It was kind of tough, and also I was the only one programming it, although I did work with guest programmers on an occasional basis. But burnout was a real factor in those days, when you had to kind of like think about over 100 films a month and do everything yourself, including the publicity. Okay, I think we could lose that picture of me looking very depressed there, thank you. Yeah, because we didn't have that kind of instant tool of email or like a website that people could refer to. So the phone rang all day, like people would like ring up and ask what was on, because they didn't have access to the printed programme, which were available in the foyer or distributed all around London. We also had a mailing list. People could sign up for a couple of quid to the Scala mailing list, and they received the programmes by post. And we knew from the mailing list that the Scala had an audience that was UK-wide and actually international as well, although we're a bit cheap to pay for international postage. But we knew that people came to the Scala from all over the UK. It wasn't just a London thing. And one of the things that really facilitated that was the location of King's Cross, because it was an excellent both British Rail and Underground network hub. So people could get there very easily. So that's what it was like. King's Cross was quite a difficult area to work in. It was by the late 80s, early 90s, there was a strategic programme to kind of degenerate the area, to clear out leases, to get rid of like short-term housing tenants, and it was a kind of clearance of King's Cross, because the mayor and the government wanted to make way for the new Channel Tunnel to come into the area. What was a very, very notorious area. It was notorious for drugs and prostitution and violence, and then the Scala was sort of sitting in the middle of all of this, like some kind of safe haven. And people often talk about what a sort of, adventure it was to get just from the tube to the cinema without being propositioned or something happening to you en route. But people would sort of dash between those areas rather than sort of, I think, loiter between them, and then feel very safe once they were inside the cinema.
I was going to say, we could do this all night, but I'm worried about time, and we haven't even got to the film.
Oh,
so
God.
we need to like go forward a bit.
All right. Okay. So I'll tell you really quickly what happened. So Scala closed down in 1993 because the lease ran out. A little while ago, I mentioned we were on a 12-year lease, and I've just actually touched on the fact that the leases were disappearing in King's Cross because British Rail owned the land, tube trains run underneath the station. And so actually on my first day at work in 1988, I got served a notice, a compulsory purchase order on the lease of the building. So we knew the lease was running out. We tried very hard to find a new a way of extending the lease, to find a way of like maybe moving to another building. But Scala's parent company, Palace Pictures, went bankrupt in 1992. They'd overextended as a company, at a time when banks were pulling in the loans. So Palace had gone bankrupt, and Stephen Woolley and Nick Powell were the directors of the Scala, which was a standalone company, but we couldn't get loans with our directors bankrupt and the lease running out. And then Clockwork Orange came along. Genius programmer here made the great decision to show a surprise film, which was at that time unavailable for distribution in the UK. So I showed A Clockwork Orange under an assumed title. I think I called it a surprise film or something, you know, mysterious like that, in a double bill with the Lindsay Anderson film If. And about 40 people turned up. And one of those people reported the screening to the film's distribution company, Warner Brothers, who passed it to the film distribution
association.
Yeah, the FDA, that's right, who gave me a thrashing, and they then passed it to the police, who pursued a prosecution against me as the person that had programmed the film. And the court case went on for a year. It was not the worst thing that had ever happened, but it was like distracting at a time when we were trying to look for ways of keeping the Scala going. I'd actually left to work for a distribution company called Electric Pictures by that point, but my successor, Helen DeWitt, had a real hard time like dealing with all of this. There were kind of changing trends in cinema going. The audience was declining, the area was getting very run down, and the money was dwindling, and the directors were bankrupt. But most of all, the lease ran out in June 1993. We packed up everything, and Helen kept all of these items that I showed you, the books, the ledgers, because we thought we were going to try and reopen the cinema. So she kept all of that material safe. I couldn't really get the Scala out of my system, but I did go on and do a series of other jobs, mostly in distribution and exhibition, in various kind of guises, including some freelance work. But I kept coming back to the Scala, and I wanted to write about it. And I'd written a couple of articles, one for Sight and Sound, one for a book called Shock Express. But I proposed to I got to the point where I was at the BFI, I took voluntary redundancy in order to write a book about the Scala. And so my book was written and published. I'm going to show it to you. It's big, it's massive. Here it is. This is the Scala book. And it's basically all of the Scala programs with a bit of history and an introduction and an index at the end. So all you cinema programmers who need an index, it's here in my book. That came out in 2018, and it's published by a great Fab Press, who are fantastic. And I had a fabulous editor called Ali Catterall, who helped me clear out all of the kind of spelling mistakes and all of the nonsense, and most of all my appalling grammar. He really helped with the book, an enormous amount. And we became friends, and he was someone who'd been to the Scala as a student up the road at Kingsway College when he was very young, when he was 16 as well. So the idea for a documentary came from showing this book to Channel X, who, for anyone who's seen The Detectorists on TV, they made that, Shooting Stars, the Vic and Bob comedy programme. And I'll stop in a second. They were interested in making a documentary about the Scala, having fond memories of it themselves. So the research that I'd done for the book was combined with some research for a documentary. I was aware of quite a bit of archive footage of the Scala that existed. Ali and I set about making a film with a bit of funding from the BFI Doc Society and a bit of funding from a fabulous bunch of people who went through the Kickstarter campaign to finish the Scala documentary. And we've nearly finished it. So here we are, up to date.
So I'm going to try and round some quick, and sorry about my cat. My cat's me. If anyone can hear meowing, that's my cat. Like, I knew we couldn't go all the way through with that, children or cats or dog or something. You were talking about it before.
Oh,
I was wondering if, obviously, the Scala was known, it was an incredible influence on so many musicians and writers and film directors. It was, as you sort of referred to, it was a kind of an amazing creative space. I was wondering if once the book came out, did some of what came out from that, did people approach you with their stories or say, oh my gosh, and did that then inform what went into the film?
yeah, a little bit. Like, for example, at the book launch, a guy came up to me and he said, I was electrocuted live on stage at the Scala Tottenham Street. And so we researched the story, which I don't have in the book, that I found out was completely true. It's a guy who, so we captured that story. We found an eyewitness, Mark Moore, the DJ, the guy in S Express. He was a real regular Scala goer. And so I think, but what we really did with the documentary was drill deeper into the first person testimonies of the people that had been to the Scala. I didn't really know who they were at the time. I knew a few, like I'd found out that Christopher Nolan was a regular Scala goer, for example. And I'd found out a couple of filmmakers. I mean, we knew, like, at the time you'd recognise, you go, oh, look, there's Nick Rogue, or there's David Hockney, or there's Francis Bacon, the artist, people that you'd recognise, but we didn't recognise Peter Strickland or Ben Wheatley or Mary Harron, because those people had yet to become filmmakers. Beeben Kidron, we came up with lots of them at the end. We captured lots of names: Martin McDonough, Steve McQueen, John Compfra, Isaac Julian. Most of them we didn't really know about. Then Ali and I reached out to a mixture of filmmakers, musicians, who we discovered were there, like Matt Johnson from Douglas Hart from Jesus Mary Chain, Jar Wobble from Public Image. And some agreed and some didn't. There were lots of great people that we asked, but they were not available or they weren't feeling it. So we decided to really focus on the people who really were passionate about the subject of the Scala. And so we did 50 interviews with, like I said, comedians like Adam Buxton, Stuart Lee. And we had to reduce all of that down to a combination of archive footage, movie clips, graphics, interviews, and a little bit of newly commissioned animation. If we've got time, I can show you a single frame of the animation. And I won't be able to tell you the story in depth, but suffice to say, it's a former member of staff, not me, who went on a very unpleasant acid trip while trying to sell tickets in the box office. And this is what she saw. There we go. This is a bit of original animation by a great animator called Osbert Parker, who'd been in the audience at Scala at the time. And he animated a story by our front of house staff, Ali Cayley, who also did projection at the Scala. And those are tentacled monsters trying to break down what was the box office. And there's one last picture I'd like to show you of another one of our interviewees. And it's the guy that also did the original music for the film, who we interviewed for the film. And if you could show us, please, Sammy, the picture of Barry Adamson. There he is, wonderful Barry, being interviewed in the Scala, which is today a music venue. And the person operating the clapperboard is Heather Wang. She was our runner and clapperboard girl person, and she is a film student at the London Film School. We work with a lot of film students on the sound and parts of the film. People who are much too young to have ever been there, but they brought a real energy to the fact that Ali and I and our producers were all over the age of 50. So we got this kind of balance of, old hacks who were there at the time and young people who brought their energy to the project. Thank you.
We've got a couple of questions for you, Jane. Hopefully we'll have time before we go. So someone has asked, Dominic has asked, was there anything that you wished you had have shown that you didn't?
Oh my goodness. I mean, there were so many films that I was always chasing, and I just couldn't track down the prints, most likely. couldn't track down the prints. As you know, I couldn't track down the rights to Clockwork Orange. But being able to track down the print was, meant that you couldn't show it, because we did not have video projection at all. I'm going to show you very quickly a program that I worked on, which was a program of Richard Kern's short films, which we did show on, I think, Betamax or U-matic or something. And getting that U-matic projector to work in Scala was an absolute nightmare. The whole thing ran about 3 hours late. Nobody could make it work. Horror show, absolute, not in the Clockwork Orange sense. So I remember trying very, very hard to get a film called The World's Greatest Cinema, The World's Greatest Cinema, The World's Greatest Sinner, directed by Timothy Carey, the character actor, and I could never get a print of that. There were loads of things that I would love to have shown and couldn't get hold of copies of. Today it feels like a different world, honestly. I know that there's still lots of films that you can't track down materials or rights for, even if you can project Blu-rays or DCP, but it was a really limited pool of films back then.
And then we have a question from Ray, which is, do you think with the current business situation that an independent cinema like the Scala can evolve again, especially with venue availability in a central location? Is there any advice you would give to do this again?
Yeah, I think with a bit of money behind it and a lease that's not running out and a set of really enthusiastic people, that you could definitely do this. And if you go and check out the Garden Cinema in Holborn, you'll find this incredible Art Deco chocolate box 2-screen cinema that's privately owned by an enthusiast who I understand is a former lawyer. And is run by people who are mad about film and showing an incredible repertory program mixed in with sort of like off first run. I think like most cinemas in London are kind of like rep at the moment, because they're not showing like 5 screenings a day of the same film. They'll mix and match between different films at different times, and they'll all be first run films. So you'll get like a 2-3 screen cinema that's showing 10 films a day by mixing and matching like that. So yeah, I do think it's possible. Yes, I do.
Be nice if somebody, it would be slightly different, because it is a different kind of world, isn't it? I think that space, the reason that people talk about it, I mean, as you touched on it a bit, but obviously people may be aware of Scalarama, the kind of screening series of all the kind of clubs around the UK who took their inspiration from the Scala. And as you said, quite a lot of them are too young to have ever been there. But I think the Scala was, what we who work in what is the very unfashionable bit of the film industry, exhibition, kind of love that it created a space where, as you said, people felt welcome, where maybe there were other spaces where they didn't feel welcome, and they also found their kind of tribe. And there was a sort of moment of discovery, or discovering things together collectively, which meant that something different happened, that it wasn't just a kind of, it's not just a screening, it's not just a cinema, that something different is happening in that place, a bit like a kind of club, or people often talk about the hacienda. It's got that kind of similar vibe, hasn't it? Which obviously that was a club and it was about music, but it was about something else, not just.
No, you're absolutely right. And it was also, it wasn't really top down. I mean, I was just the cipher for the program. I always say the Scala audience really programmed the Scala by continuing to turn up to the things they turn up to. But I dug out this program from June 91, and what's interesting to me about this is the number of collaborators on it. So you've got the Festival of British Comedy, which wasn't programmed by me. There are lots of things that call themselves festivals on this programme, including actually the Piccadilly Film Festival, which was a really interesting kind of sort of version of the Edinburgh Film Festival in London. And there you can see a preview of Tetsuo, Edward Scissorhands, Strip Jack Naked, which is the follow-up to Nighthawks. But there's other things that you can see on this programme as well. You can also see like South Africa Freedom Day. This is like, Scala really wore its politics on its sleeve and was doing lots of like benefit screenings. You can see something that calls itself the Avant-Garde Erotic Short Film Festival, which was me just programming in muck from the London Filmmakers Co-op. You can see a guest appearance by Dario Argento. That was something that the film programmer Alan Jones of Fright Fest brought to the table. You can also fascinatingly see Quim magazine presenting a women-only all-nighter. And this is something that Scala did regularly. And I think it's something that I think in this, sorry to use that old fogey expression, in this day and age would be hard to imagine. I don't know if there are a lot of women-only things that go on, but this was a sort of outrageous programme of films, live acts and sex in the back row. Basically, that's what it is. That's what it was. That was Quim Magazine Presents.
Fabulous. We've got one, I think we've got time for one last question from Hannah, who says, incredible talk, thanks so much. I can't wait till the film is out. Do you have a rough estimate date of when it will be finished, stroke released? And then a second question, which is, what was your favorite? This is like, what is your, you cannot ask the film program what your favorite film is. It's sort of like, it's different every like 10 minutes. Anyway, what was your favorite film that you saw or programmed at the Scala? So the first bit is, when is the film, when do you think the film will be released or finished?
Well, it has to come out this year because 2023 is the 30th anniversary of the closure of the Scala. So it's a nice kind of like milestone to reach. We're just finishing off the grade and the sound mix. Some amazing people working on the film. Again, people who've been in the audience. Everybody's been working on the film between other jobs. My co-director Ali is a business journalist. I work in a shop in East London. One of our producers is Andy Stark, who's produced about 5 other films while we've been making our Scala documentary over the last couple of years. And the same with the grader and the sound mixer. They're film professionals who are working on other things. So we're aiming for the first half of this year to have everything completely signed off and locked and polished, and would love to find a festival premiere, both internationally and in the UK. We're talking to film distributors about it at the moment. The film is 98 minutes long. The intention is for it to be shown in the first instance on cinema screens. It really looks great on the big screen. We've tested it out in a couple of places and it looks fabulous. And we think that programmers and audiences will like it. It's funny, it's very, very funny. So it will be out at some point this year. When exactly depends on whether or not we get offered a festival premiere. So we will see about that. And in answer to the second question, the film that I liked the best was the one that made the most, ones that made the most money, because as a programmer, it gave me a lot of reassurance to know that I could guarantee making money from showing Thundercrack, Sallow, I Know Corrida and Cafe Flesh. Those are quite hardcore films in their own way. But my personal favourite is something much softer and gentler in some ways. It's Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, and I love that film so much. Stan Hart, God rest his soul.
You loved Stan Hart.
Opened up the filing cabinet one day and said to me, I've got something in my filing cabinet, I've just found the key, you might like it. And it was an American 4-sheet poster for Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, which I meant to put behind me and failed to do so. So Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, which I loved to programme with John Waters' Female Trouble, was one of my favourite double bills, and it's the one that I always wheel out when people ask me to choose a Scala double bill. And we were so honoured that John Waters, great film director, was one of the people interviewed for our film, and he's brilliant in it. He's so funny, and he prosecutes me, he cross questions me about the Clockwork Orange my screening of Clockwork Orange, and that's a great moment in the film.
Oh, I look forward to that. I love that story actually, because now when you talk about it now, it's like these are the things that you might do when you're young. You know what I mean? That's what you do those things. I can imagine you thinking, right, I'm just going to do it. You know what I mean? And later on, with hindsight, you think, oh, well, actually, maybe.
Well, yeah, no, it was horrible to be dragged through the court for the year and to see my name in the newspaper and have to explain to my family why I was being prosecuted. But my brother phoned me up and said, I'm really proud of you. And that was a great moment for me, actually. And yeah, it was, I would do it all again. Bring it on.
That's a great moment to end on. So thank you so much, Jane. Thanks so much for spending this evening with us and for all those stories. I'm really, really, really looking forward to seeing the film, and we'll let everybody know when it's out. Thank you so much again for your time today.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you to everybody who joined, and see you at the screenings.
Bye.